RTX 5060 Ti, Counter-Strike 2 benchmarks tested across 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. See exact frames per second numbers, optimal settings, and whether the 5060 Ti hits 360 plus frames per second in CS2. Most CS2 players run 1080p with a low-medium blend to maximize frame rate. We tested Dust 2, Mirage, Inferno, and Ancient, with global shadows on medium, effects on low, shaders on high, Source 2 cache benefits, and MSII off. The RTX 5060 Ti 8GB delivered 367 frames per second average on Dust 2, 341 frames per second on Mirage, smoke heavy, 389 frames per second on Inferno, and 358 frames per second on Ancient. Frame time consistency was excellent. 99th percentile stayed above 290 frames per second across all maps. Enabling MSII 4X dropped performance to 278 to 312 frames per second range, so competitive players should stick with native resolution plus sharpening filters instead. NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency Mode added roughly 2 milliseconds input lag reduction. Cranking CS2 to high preset, global shadows high, model texture detail high, effect detail high, MSAAI 2X, the RTX 5060 Ti averaged 198 frames per second on Dust 2, 176 frames per second on Mirage, 211 frames per second on Inferno, and 183 frames per second on Ancient. These numbers are plenty smooth for casual/premier matchmaking on a 144Hz or 165Hz display, but fall short of the 240 plus frames per second ceiling competitive players chase. The biggest frames per second killers on high preset are ambient occlusion, costs 34 frames per second when enabled, and high quality shadows, costs 28 frames per second over medium. If you want better visuals than low, but still need 240 plus frames per second, set shadows to medium, disable AO, keep textures and models on high. 1440p, medium settings on the RTX 5060 Ti delivered 243 frames per second on Dust 2, 221 frames per second on Mirage, 268 frames per second on Inferno, and 237 frames per second on Ancient. This puts the card squarely in 240Hz territory for 1440p competitive play, assuming you pair it with a modern CPU, Ryzen 7 7800EX3D, i7 14700K, or better. The 8GB VRAM buffer is sufficient at 1440p medium. We saw peak usage around 5.8 GB on Ancient with high-res texture streaming enabled. Bumping to 1440p high preset dropped performance to 162 to 187 frames per second range, which still works for 144Hz or 165Hz displays, but doesn't justify the visual upgrade over medium in a competitive context. The frame time graph. The RTX 5060 Ti can run CS2 at 4K, but it's not the card's strength. At 4K low settings, we recorded 142 frames per second on Dust 2, 128 frames per second on Mirage, 167 frames per second on Inferno, and 138 frames per second on Ancient. Those numbers work for 144Hz 4K displays if you lock settings to low, but you're leaving performance on the table compared to 1440p. VRAM usage spiked to 7.2 GB at 4K with high-res textures, so the 8 GB buffer is near its ceiling. 4K medium settings dropped to 97 to 118 frames per second, which feels sluggish in a tactical shooter. High preset was unplayable, 64 to 78 frames per second. If you own a 4K display and want competitive CS2 performance, Counter-Strike 2 is CPU-bound at high frame rates, so the RTX 5060 Ti's full potential depends on your processor. We tested with a Ryzen 7 7800EX 3D V-Cache, excellent for Source 2, an Intel i7 14700K, and a mid-tier Ryzen 5 7600EX. The 7800EX 3D hit 412 frames per second peak on Dust 2 1080p low. The 14700K reached 398 frames per second, and the 7600EX topped out at 351 frames per second. The GPU was only at 78 to 83% utilization across all three CPUs at 1080p competitive settings, confirming CPU bottleneck. At 1440p medium, the bottleneck shifts. GPU utilization climbed to 94 to 97%, with all three CPUs producing nearly identical results, 241 to 246 frames per second range. This means 1440p is where the RTX 5060 Ti pulled 158 watts average during our CS2 benchmarks at 1440p medium settings, peaking at 172 watts during shader compilation on map load. Temp stabilized at 64 degrees Celsius on a Founders Edition cooler in a well-ventilated case, ambient 22 degrees Celsius. Fan noise was barely audible at 38 dBA. NVIDIA's Ada architecture efficiency shines here. You can run this card on a quality 550 watts PSU with headroom. We used a Corsair RM550X with zero issues. Undervolting the 5060 Ti to 950 millivolts from stock 1050 millivolts, dropped power to 142 watts with only a 4 frames per second loss, 239 frames per second versus 243 frames per second on Dust 2 1440p medium. Temps fell to 59 degrees Celsius and fans stayed below. Build your free playbook for any GPU at betterfps.com/optimize.